IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Aditya Pareek. Before we begin, I would just like to mention that admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate programs in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology and policy, and health and life sciences. Application deadline is 28th August and the cohort begins 1st September. To know more, visit takshashila.org.in/courses. Now coming to today's episode. To discuss India's semiconductor ecosystem, I have with me today Samparna, Amol, and Anup. Welcome, folks.
Hi, Aditya. Thanks.
Hi, Aditya.
Thank you, Aditya.
Samparna works as a product marketing specialist by day and public policy analyst by night. She is pursuing PGP in public policy here at Takshashila and has chosen Strengthening Semiconductors Ecosystem in India as a capstone project. Amol Sarin runs his own capital equipment business, Contechnic Enterprise, an ex-GCPP alumni from Takshashila. He has worked earlier with Cyprus Semiconductor, where he was exposed to the semicon industry and its importance. Anup is co-founder at Envir AI. He worked on semiconductor design at Texas Instruments and has experience in applied machine learning from large city scale designs to batteryless microelectronics. So to start with, let me ask you, Samparna, why do semiconductors matter?
Thanks, Aditya. Great question to start with. So the other two panelists, right, Amol and Anup, both have worked in the semiconductor industry, and I am a semiconductor novice. Even my brother was asking, why on earth are you so interested in semiconductors? So I'm just going to explain to the audience and to you what I told my brother. Let me just paint a mental picture for you. This is a typical scene in a time when we used to go for a vacation in 90s, right? So my mom is this person who meticulously packs everything that we would require for a vacation. We would borrow this bulky Motorola phone from one of my uncles because it was expensive and my mom and dad both couldn't afford it at that point of time. We used to pack in camera, batteries, hard cash, maybe a map. There was this diary which consisted of all these emergency phone numbers and some books and magazines. So we would chug 20 kilos of additional luggage whenever we used to go on holidays because we had to have everything that we could possibly need, right? And cut to 2021, I do not really think that I would require any of these things because I just have a phone in my pocket and that's it. So this entire transition, right, for a person in daily life, we think of this as a digital revolution. We talk about modernization in society, but all of this actually comes down to this innocent looking chip that actually powers all these devices around us. So everything modern around us is actually powered by chips, which we actually call as semiconductors, right? So if I have to put down in numbers, somewhere in 1960s, one single IC, which is an integrated circuit, would carry some 64 transistors. And right now, we are talking about 1.7 billion transistors on a single chip. So just imagine the amount of functionality, performance, speed, that is all packed into one small, tiny looking chip which sits in any of your devices, whether it's a phone or an Alexa that is there in our drawing rooms, right? So basically, semiconductors are nothing but the brains of modern day electronics. It can be in consumer goods. It can be in the most sophisticated defense and space equipment that we have, which is used for strategic purposes. Also, semiconductors are the foundation of all the other modern technologies that we are working on today, whether it is artificial intelligence. Chips dictate how fast data basically moves between a memory and a processor, right? But everything on processing of terabytes of data is based on the power of the chip. Automotives, when you're talking about smart vehicles, we're talking about electric vehicles, autonomous driving, high safety standards. Those are dictated by chips. Similarly, we are talking about revolution in communication through 5G. All of that is also powered by semiconductors. So the semiconductors are the foundation of everything that is technology these days. And so we cannot imagine any technological progress happening without semiconductors. So that's the first reason why semiconductors are important. The second reason why semiconductors are important, of course, as I listed down the various applications of it, you can understand the economic contribution of semiconductors would also be extremely high. Standalone semiconductor sales is somewhere around 480 billion US dollars in terms of global volume of sales. While if we are talking about in terms of downstream impact, you could total it up to trillion of US dollars, around 2.2 to 2.3 trillion US dollars, just by the amount of downstream industries who are using chips as a part of their structure, right? And this is something that was not really out on the forefront or being discussed in the news. But when the pandemic actually happened, I think all of us must have read about the prices of consumer electronics shooting up, automotives getting affected because there was this global chip shortage, right? More or less, I think 60 billion US dollars in revenues were lost in a single year because in automotive alone, because of the fact that there were lockdowns happening and factories were shut down and chips could not reach the destination plants. So that's how important it is from an economic perspective, both in terms of contribution to GDP, employment creation, and everything else. And finally, semiconductors are extremely important in the geopolitical standing of nations, right? So before I speak about that, I would just like to mention that as the nature of the semiconductor industry is such that it is distributed in the sense that there are some pockets in the world which specialize, let's say, in a manufacturing. There are some pockets which specialize in design, and so on and so forth. So it's all distributed. Like each one of those countries have their own kind of specialization, which basically means that you need to have good international relations in order for the semiconductor industry to actually work, right? Because it gets designed somewhere else, it gets manufactured somewhere else, and it gets assembled somewhere else. Now, what has happened in the case of US-China conflicts that we must be reading in the newspapers is that China per se has a deficiency in semiconductors, and since it is like an Achilles heel, what it is trying to do is it is trying to become self-sufficient in semiconductors. And understanding the role that US plays, US wants to thwart this particular plan of China to become self-sufficient, and that is the reason why US is denying access to a lot of things that it specializes in. So if, as an example, US specializes in equipment, right, or materials, so it is imposing a lot of export controls and sanctions so that China does not have access to it. Similarly, China is trying to control Taiwan, which is also a key player, whether it is through, there is always this threat of nationalization that is, going on in the case of Taiwan. There are, reports of cyber attacks happening on the Taiwanese industry. So Taiwan controls a whole section of manufacturing and assembly. And let us say tomorrow there would be a situation where China would try to control Taiwan, then it could actually cut off US from that particular source. So what we see right now is that semiconductors have become like a front in the trade wars between, US and China. And probably the entire world is also a part of this entire conflict. So tomorrow, it is possible that some country may decide to choke off supply, and which basically means that economies, industries will get severely affected, and nations will not be prepared to do what they have to do to save their industries. So this is the reason why semiconductors are super critical on both on the technological front, on the economic front, and on the geopolitical front. Just to give a picture on in terms of where India is, and that's the reason why we are actually discussing this today, is that India needs to, we think that India needs to strategically think about building a resilience in its supply chain ecosystem, because we are really, really small in the larger scheme of things right now, right? As I said, the entire global market is around 440 billion, and there India is probably contributing a value addition of 34, 35 billion US dollars in only the design services market, where we have a strength. In the rest of the value chain, which is like a manufacturing or an assembly, we are really, really nascent. So for India, there are two things that are important. One is, of course, it's a big market. We can take a share of that market because it's an economic opportunity for us. Plus, we need to understand that it should not be a case of using as a strategic tool against us. So we need to ensure that we make our supply chain systems resilient, so that in case of any geopolitical conflict, we cannot be cut off from semiconductor sources that drive our industries. So this is why semiconductors matter, and that's the reason we are so passionate about this subject, Aditya.
Interesting. So a publication by you folks has come out, a slide doc about India's semiconductor ecosystem, which we would link in the description of this episode. So it mentions a semiconductors value chain in it. So can you put this in context for our listeners, Samparna?
Absolutely. So just like any production process, right? So there is there are stages in production of any particular component. So even with semiconductors, there are 5 important functional stages, right? So the first stage and the last stage, you could say, are the supporting stages, while there are 3 main stages in between, right? So let me just start with the first one, which is research and development, right? Now, as I had mentioned in the previous section, that what has happened in the case of semiconductors is that there has been an attempt by the industry to pack more and more performance, speed, and capabilities into chips which are shrinking in size. And at the same time, you also want to make it affordable to customers. So what has happened there is that at every stage you're trying to push the limits of physics, and so a lot of research and development needs to go into ensuring that that kind of miniaturization actually happens, right? So when we used to hear Steve Jobs, talking about something that you could carry in your pocket, basically he was talking about the entire emphasis of R&D, which would actually go into creating these powerful miniature devices. So R&D is a critical component of the semiconductor value chain, and any country which needs to have success needs to have a very good R&D ecosystem, right? And it kind of feeds primarily into the design stage, which is the next stage. But R&D is also applicable in other parts of the value chain as well, as I'll describe later. So the first stage is R&D, right? Very extremely capital intensive. If 100 rupees is the amount that you spend on the total production, probably 25% of the total cost actually goes into R&D. So that it's that important. Then we move on to the design section. Now, designing a chip is basically nothing but conceptualizing what you want in a product according to the need of the customer, right? So what is it that you need to fit? Do you need to have better performance? Do you need to have better speed? Do you need to have something which should not heat up faster? So according to that, there will be engineers, and highly skilled people who will put in their minds in terms of designing that particular chip, right? So design as a stage is very skill intensive, right? So it requires a lot of human capital which is skilled in this particular subject. The third stage is the manufacturing stage. What happens in manufacturing is that basically the design has to be given a form, right? So there the design has to be put on, in simple words, it actually has to be put on a wafer, which is made up of silica, right? So it has to be imprinted on there. Now in a manufacturing plants per se, they need to be extremely, they need to be clean rooms, very very high specialty chemicals required for that particular purpose. It's extremely capital intensive. You need people who are trained in that particular process to operate that kind of equipment. So the standout thing about manufacturing is that number one, it is extremely capital intensive. And the second part is that obviously for manufacturing to work, you need to have good capacity utilization. So you should be having linkages with multiple people asking for chips to be manufactured at your plant, so that your plant is actually running at a 60 to 70% capacity utilization. Otherwise, it will be financially unviable for you to run a manufacturing plant, right? So that is the third stage. So we covered R&D, design, and then manufacturing, right? Once manufacturing is done, basically, then comes the part of assembly, right? So what you're doing in assembly is basically all the chips which are being manufactured, you are trying to assemble it on a single substrate, that is a package, and then ensure that, because that will be the form in which it will be finally sold to the customer, right? So assembly, testing, and packaging happens in this particular stage. As you must have imagined, this is a stage which is very labor intensive, because you are actually looking like, almost like a series plant, assembly plant, where you are bringing in different components and putting them together on a single chip. That is what happens in assembly. So this is very labor intensive. Now, the last stage, which is an optional stage, is distribution. In the sense that why I say it is optional is because sometimes assembly plants can directly sell to a company like Samsung, which is a device manufacturer. So once the entire chip has been assembled, it can be directly sold to Samsung, which it can incorporate in its mobile phones. Sometimes it may not be efficient to directly sell to these device manufacturers. So what you will do is you will have distributors who are like a via media. So in the case of distributors, their strength basically lies in their logistics network, so that they can bring in components assembled from various places, and then give them to the manufacturers, to the device manufacturers like a Foxconn or a Samsung, at very reasonable costs, right? So these are the 5 stages which is a part of a value chain: R&D, design, manufacturing, assembly, testing, marking and packaging, and the last one is distribution, right? So as I said, among this, the 3, which is design, manufacturing, and assembly, are actually the core production activities. Design is pre-production and distribution is post-production, right? So apart from these main components in the value chain, there are also, ancillary ecosystems which are a part of the semiconductor value chain. Just an example, in case of designing, when you're designing a chip, you must have heard of, something like a CAD tool, right? Computer aided design. So where you can actually draw out the design of the chip. So in the case of semiconductors, you have something called as electronic design automation tools, EDA tools. These are quite expensive tools, and there are specific companies that produce the software for this. So they are a component here. Similarly, there are some companies which own the intellectual property for processors that are being used. So for example, let me give you an example of Intel's x86, right? So it's a proprietary it's a proprietary processor that is being used as a part of the chip. So anybody who owns the IP of these architectures is also a part of the ecosystem. And apart from that, you have, so the basically the chip per se, that wafer is made from silicon oxide. So obviously you would have to depend on somebody who is mining sand, and then you would have to depend on somebody who is producing those specialty gases, for etching, doing that kind of etching or making a pattern on that particular silicon wafer. So those kind of equipment, specialty gas, raw material suppliers are also a part of this supporting ecosystem, right? Now, the reason why this semiconductor value chain is important is, again, what I had mentioned in the past, is that over a period of time, what has happened is, because there is a constant pressure to push the limits of physics and pack more and more performance into a smaller chip, economics dictates that you start to do specialization instead of trying to do everything under the same umbrella, because you will just not be able to manage the costs. What companies have done is that they have taken up certain areas which they would specialize in. So there is somebody who is specializing in design, there is somebody who is specializing in manufacturing, somebody who is specializing in assembly, so on and so forth. So this is basically what has happened, and there is like a vertical specialization, and all these specializations are geographically dispersed. So you would have something like a United States, which is like a design powerhouse. You would have something like a Taiwan, which is a powerhouse in manufacturing and even in assembly and packaging. So that's how distributed it is, right? And these have also dictated business models, right? So in the past, in when you're talking about 1960s or 70s, as I said, right, earlier everybody was trying to do everything. So you had companies like Intel, which is actually called as an integrated device manufacturer. They would try to do all the parts of the supply chain in-house, R&D, design, manufacturing. But over a period of time, the costs ballooned so much that now companies have transitioned into something called as a fabless foundry model, which is nothing but every single step being done by different companies. So there's one company that does the design, somebody will do the manufacturing, somebody will do the assembly, and then they will distribute it to the OEMs. That is the entire concept of the semiconductor value chain.
Thanks, Samparna, for that comprehensive answer. So, Anup, let me ask you. So, you've mentioned that India's strength lies in its design ecosystem. Can you elaborate on that? Is there a missing link in making India a design powerhouse?
Yes, certainly, Aditya. So, I believe India's strength does lie in the design ecosystem, especially because of the sheer strength of our human capital. So, we produce a huge talent pool of engineering graduates every year, some of whom are able to enter the ASIC design system. Now, the design part of the ASIC cycle, out of all that Samparna just mentioned, at the very basic level, just requires an internet connection, possibly to the global headquarters, and a decent workstation, because all you're essentially doing is working on CAD tools. Now, this has allowed global MNCs to establish their India footprint with relative ease compared to other activities, like manufacturing, assembly, or testing, which requires a lot of other work as well. Now, initially, quite a lot of these offices were into support activities, but they are now gradually moving on to latest cutting edge techniques and technologies which are at par with their global headquarters. And because of this kind of exposure that our talent is getting, potentially Indian startups in the ASIC space would love to hire this kind of talent. Or this is the talent that would possibly come out and build something which will be of global standards. Now, there's also a major portion of this, which is the Indian design services sector. So they create, it's a huge body of talent which is industry ready for support function. So essentially, we've got design as well as support, both of them happening in India. Now, at the same time, since you asked, is there a missing link in making India a design powerhouse? Now, quite a lot of this, goes back to poor IP creation. Now, despite the fact that we create around 1.5 million engineers every year, there's a huge imbalance in the quality of engineers being trained, because by most standards, most of them are unemployable, even if you give them industry specific training. But there's a small part of this talent which is high performance. They go on to do specialization or research activity, you know, uh, generally outside India, which results in lesser opportunities for homegrown IP, to come out from academic research. Now, because of this itself is self-limiting in terms of IP generation. So if you're not producing enough IP within the academic circles, you're not generating enough IP which might flow into the startup ecosystem. So to some extent, if we could attract Indian talent back from overseas, this might mitigate this problem for the short term. But in the long term, yes, we need to focus on getting IP output from within India. On the other hand, starting any new venture in this space requires a lot of financial commitment because of costly EDA software licenses, staff salaries which are large, as well as the ability to play the long game, because fabrication, test, assembly, and then in case there's a failure, you need to respin and redo the whole cycle again. So this requires a lot of patience, and even otherwise, there's a lot of patience required because semiconductors require huge scale to be profitable. This itself might take a long time, and there might be multiple cycles before your target industry finds your IC acceptable. So essentially, what we need is very patient risk capital, which is a little difficult to find because right now it's the era of software enabled boom, so to say.
Okay. So we move on to the next question. So coming to you, Amol, about the manufacturing segment, India has made many prior attempts to attract manufacturers to set up plants here. So why hasn't it yet taken off, in your opinion?
That's a very pertinent question, Aditya. Primarily, why the sector hasn't taken off, the manufacturing of semiconductor hasn't taken off in India is because of our misplaced priorities. And by misplaced priorities, I mean to say we are concentrating on the leading edge. We were concentrating till now on the leading edge nodes. Now, in semiconductor, as Samparna had also mentioned earlier, the idea is to pack in more transistors as we go along. So, with the leading edge nodes, which are over the ones which are over less than say 65 nanometer technology, say 5 nanometers or 12 nanometers, it becomes very capital intensive. So, the cost of building up these kinds of leading edge nodes is over $5 billion. And for any private player to come in and chip in that amount of money, which will take around, say, 2 years, it will take for the fab to come up, 2 years again for the capacity to ramp up. And the ROI that that private player will be getting is still not certain because maybe 10 years down the line, the technology would have changed. There would be a different technology, as in we would have moved to further leading edge nodes. So that is one basic reason why we have actually not been able to take off in the on the manufacturing side. What we can do actually is we can concentrate more on the trailing edge nodes, which again is a low hanging fruit, nodes over 65 nanometers. And there are a lot of applications which still require those nodes. So, for example, analog devices or your radio frequency chips or chips used in the automobile or the medical sector, IoT devices, all of these require the trailing edge nodes, which are over 90 nanometers. And these trailing edge nodes are comparatively cheaper. The fabs to set up these nodes are comparatively cheaper. It's around $1 billion, and the ROI also is faster. And apart from that, the other fabrication plants that we can look at are the gallium nitride plants, where we can actually look at the 5G applications which require these kinds of nodes. The third thing, which has actually, so apart from the leading edge, our focus on the leading edge, the other thing that has actually led to manufacturing being a non-starter has been the our has been our policy of the government. Earlier, the government in the 2014 policy was concentrating more on the leading edge again, In 2019, they have actually done away with that. But still, with the rising geopolitical tensions over the last few years, the other governments have really pledged a lot of money, close to around $640 billion, to set up plants locally. So that is again something that India has to step up its game, and only then we will have a good manufacturing base here in India.
Thanks, Amol. So now we'll take a short break, folks. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, comedian Sahil Shah joins Cyrus and Antrish for a hilarious Cock and Bull episode. Marathi Kirkiton, our latest show, is all about Marathi culture, tradition, literature, cuisine, and more. To make your rainy day better, hear from Manik and Dr. Rajiv Deshmukh sharing their beautiful moments in this first episode. Avinash Pant from Facebook shares his journey in the advertising industry on Filter Coffee. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet talks to Asad about leveling up as a musician, going from DJ to producer. On Tere Mere Raste, we revisit Amritsar's bloody history and mesmerizing glory. And on Storytime Tamil, a parable narrates a lesson on having restraint. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word about a podcast you love. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week: Seat, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and CoinSwitch Kuber.
Welcome back, folks. We're discussing India's semiconductor ecosystem. So, Samparna, you earlier mentioned that the assembly, testing, and packaging segment is labor intensive. Does that mean it could work in India's favor?
Absolutely correct, Aditya. I mean, this is actually the right time for India to consider, leveraging its, strength in terms of labor availability to kickstart, something in assembly, testing, and packaging segment. As I had mentioned earlier, ATMP segment is, labor intensive. It's high volume and low margin in business, right? So, as far as India is concerned, we have a sizable number of people, passing out with diploma and BTech in, an electrical engineering or a mechanical or electronics engineering, who could qualify to be shop floor technicians or entry level engineering staff in these assembly plants, right? And this is also the time when a lot of companies are actually looking at offshoring or diversifying their assembly or diversifying the places from where assembly happens, because right now most of the assembly parts are concentrated in China and Taiwan, right? In addition to the geopolitical tensions in that particular area, it is also susceptible to natural disasters, and in general for supply chain resilience it is much better to always have redundancy. And India can emerge as a good player in the ATMP space, provided it acknowledges and understands the way in which the demands of the industry and skills its people to ensure that assembly segment takes off, right? India already has some experience in the downstream assembly of electronic components. So we must have heard about the news of Samsung building the world's largest mobile phone manufacturing plant in India. There it does testing of new devices and assembles them for export. Similarly, Foxconn is planning to invest $1.3 billion US in India in an assembly plant. So we already have that experience in downstream assembly. What we need to do is carry it upstream in order to do the assembly of ICs, that is integrated circuit chips. Now, one thing we need to understand as far as assembly is concerned is that, of course, labor cost is definitely an advantage, but then, companies who are thinking about setting up assembly plants here, they also need to factor other costs. For example, do they have affordable access to fabrication plants or not, right? Because you need to import the wafers that have been manufactured somewhere else, right? And then you also need to have customers to whom you sell, which basically means that you need to have appropriate linkages with companies like a Samsung or a Foxconn or all these ODMs. And so you need to kind of be able to export to them as well, right? Now, this is where companies in Vietnam are also emerging as a competition, because these guys are, first of all, quite close to China. So the cost of importing raw materials from them is quite less. And also the fact that Vietnam is a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty, where it can just export goods free of cost to 12 nations. So those are also substantial cost advantages which companies will look at while deciding between whether they should go and set up an assembly plant in India or in Vietnam. Of course, one thing that is good that has happened in the case of India is the production linked incentive scheme that has been launched by the government. It has substantial incentives for the industry to set up plants in India. I think approximately 540 billion US dollars is the outlay there. So a lot of the costs that companies would have otherwise incurred in importing and exporting would be subsidized because of this PLI scheme. So right now, the ground seems to be ripe for India to kick off in the ATMP segment. I'll just finish this with a note saying that India also needs to understand that the window of opportunity here is small because ATMP is gradually transitioning from being labor intensive to being R&D intensive. Over a period of time, what is going to happen is you will not be able to make chips any smaller, right? It's just not physically possible to do that. And so what companies will rely on is probably packaging them in layers, right? A 2.5 dimensional or a 3-dimensional packaging. And these kind of investments will have to be taken care by the ATMP companies, which basically means that in probably 10 to 15 years, we will be looking at ATMP companies differentiating not on the basis of labor, but on the basis of R&D. So India also needs to understand that, that apart from utilizing this window of opportunity to capitalize on labor supply, it will parallelly have to start investing in R&D or at looking at other nations who can actually give us that knowledge transfer for R&D in the ATMP segment. So that's on the assembly part, Aditya.
Interesting. So, in the document, you folks also make some recommendations. So, specifically, what are your recommendations for India to improve its relative position in the global semiconductor economy? Anup, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. Yes. So it's worth reiterating that the quality of the graduates that are coming out of our institutes that definitely needs to improve. Beyond that, we need to invest a lot into research, whether it is by postgraduates or by PhD scholars, because that will possibly outweigh everything else in terms of impact, especially in the long term. Now, hopefully, this would create a self sufficient growth engine of IP creation and commercialization, which would keep feeding itself. We need to definitely expand beyond maths and computer science into even stuff like materials if we want to, propel this industry. IP protection as well as funding from defense and space programs where cost is rarely a bottleneck. That would allow some fresh products, to organically come out of India. For the longest time, we also had a situation where certain companies dominated because general purpose compute, which were what we call CPUs, was the majority of the demand from the industry. But now we have so many new areas coming up where novel ideas are welcome. For example, machine learning applications, whether it is for cloud-based data centers or for something as small as a batteryless sensor running a very compact version of machine learning, also called tiny ML commonly. There are other opportunities, for example, in power electronics because of the rise of electrical vehicles. It's allowing new designs, based on silicon carbide or gallium arsenide to come up. So that's sort of, because these are new spaces and new avenues where everybody else is also sort of, they've not leapfrogged India, so to say. So India has the opportunity if we could latch on to some of these and make some good progress there. There's another space where we do have a lot, some way to go, but by improving standards of living or ease of doing business, we might be able to attract back a lot of talent which has gone overseas, but a lot of them do want to come back now given the right opportunities. At the same time, ASIC as an industry, it has become such a complex beast that no single country without exception can go it alone. There's a strong need for collaborative engagement with some friendly countries like the US, South Korea, Japan, etc., who have deep know-hows in this field. But at the same time, they can be expected to see our growth favorably, not as a competition to them. So something like a Quad Semiconductors Consortium would be great for India to build upon.
Interesting. So, about the Quad Semiconductors Consortium specifically. So, Samparna, can you elaborate on the synergies among the participating nations and how it can help in building supply chain resilience?
Absolutely, Aditya. So the Quad countries are India, United States, Australia, and Japan, right? Of course, we have as a consortium or as a grouping, we have aligned together on many strategic objectives. Even in the space of semiconductors, the grouping of Quad per se has, if you look at the strengths of each one of each one of the countries or the participating countries, they are very complementary in nature, right? So, let's start with US. So, US is a behemoth in, semiconductor design. 62% of almost all fabless firm revenues are from there, right? You have giants like, Intel, who are also based out of the US. They have very, very high R&D spends. And so it's anybody who partners with the US obviously, gets to get an opportunity at, acquiring knowledge about the best in the industry or the latest trends in the industry. US also dominates the upstream of design. So if you remember, I mentioned in the value chain, design automation tools, which are really expensive. Similarly, companies like NVIDIA, who own the intellectual property of processor architectures. So all of these are based out of the US. So US has a lot to offer in terms of design, right? When we talk about Japan, right? Japan is important from a point of view of silicon wafer production, right? In the manufacturing leg, whether it is silicon wafers, whether it is access to the raw materials like the photoresist light sensitive material on which the pattern actually gets etched, or the gases that are used for etching that particular pattern, all of them are available in Japan. Australia is strong from a point of view of access to basic materials. We know it is rich in mineral deposits, so things like silicon, things like Amol mentioned about gallium, right? Gallium to be another competitor to silicon, where the performance has improved off chips, especially for 5G applications. That also can be mined in Australia. Lithium, which we are seeing powering batteries, the best for batteries, is also found in Australia. So you have Australia, which is rich in these materials. And then you have India. And as Anup clearly mentioned, that our strength has been our human capital, right? Which has ensured that we have such a vibrant, design ecosystem. On the other hand, we also have semi-skilled labor that could be used for the assembly segment, right? So if you put them together, they have a lot of these complementary advantages. And so what we have proposed in the paper is that while we have aligned on multiple objectives, the Quad could explore, setting up something like a Quad Consortium Fund, where they could decide about where the next fabrication plants need to be set up, whether it is in India or somewhere else. Where should they be focusing on the trailing edge nodes, as Amol mentioned, greater than 65 nanometer plants could be probably set up in India. Maybe leading edge node plants could be set up somewhere else. Similarly, having agreements for sharing IP, ensuring that good talent comes in from the United States back to India. We have access to materials from Australia, so on and so forth. I think those kind of arrangements can be worked out, which would be mutually beneficial for all the four, because then you would actually reduce your dependencies on areas which are vulnerable or very volatile in nature, like the East Asia region that we're talking about, which is both China and Taiwan. One thing that I would like to mention here is that we are not really saying that this should be an exclusive consortium. Of course, I mean, you as as the four put together, even there will also be certain missing links which all the four countries put together don't have. So the Quad should be open to negotiating and building links with probably countries who are aligned with them, whether it is in the European nation or whether it is in Southeast Asia. I mean, those things should move on parallelly. These should not be exclusive ones. It's just that put together, we can, countries cooperating together in a multilateral manner is much more feasible to kind of look at supply chain resilience and ensure that your economies are not impacted. Wherever countries, there is a mandate of, within quotes, self-sufficiency, that we will do it all alone, it is actually impossible to do that because it's financially not feasible, right? I mean, hypothetically, I think there was a semiconductor industry association report which said that if you try to build everything yourself, on upfront, it is actually going to cost around $1 trillion capex investment. Who has that kind of money to put in? And you don't even know if that money is going to give you the ROI, because by the time the plant is fully functional, the technology might have progressed to a different level. So moving forward, for India, it is best that it concentrates on its strengths. As Anup mentioned, think about design IP creation, focus on strengthening your design ecosystem, try to build expertise in the assembly segment, but just don't look inward, look outward and have multilateral cooperation, leverage your partnerships with Quad countries so that you are actually able to achieve supply chain resilience.
All right. So finally, let me ask you folks, can you recommend some sources and further readings for our listeners to dig a bit deeper, to learn more about the strategic semiconductor space?
Okay, I'll take this one, Aditya. So our document is a good starting point, our document on India's semiconductor ecosystem. Then the other document paper by Pranay Kotastane's paper on Quad Semiconductor Partnership is also a good paper to look at. Then there is a German think tank called SNV. So they have written a very decent document on the semiconductor value chain. So that is also something that people can look at to get an understanding of the entire ecosystem. And then there are people who keep on writing, who are quite passionate about this entire semiconductor industry. And they keep on writing in various publications like Arun Mampadi or Anshuman Tripathi. So those, they can be followed. So these are the suggested further readings, which we feel will help you in understanding the ecosystem a little bit better.
Samparna, would you like to mention any more sources?
Yeah, there are some reports by the Semiconductor Industry Association, since they document a lot of the latest trends. There are some standalone reports. There are some in partnership with other consulting companies as well. I think those are also great resources to look at. And people should also look at the citations that are there in these research papers, so that in case they want to deep dive further on the subject, they will be able to do so.
Okay. Before we conclude, I'd like to invite you to join our book launch session happening on the 13th of August at 6 p.m. We will have Nitin Pai in conversation with Madhav Godbole on his new book, India, a Federal Union of States. The registration link is in the description below. All right. Thank you, Samparna. Thank you, Amol. On that note, folks, we will call it a wrap. If you liked today's discussion, please do check out all past, present, and future episodes of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawala, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Nankali podcast every Wednesday. सिर्फ IVM podcast ऐप या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.